Welcome, everyone. We are now starting this virtual roundtable entitled Measuring Human Rights, Challenges and Developments. My name is Eduardo Burkle. I'm a PhD student at the University of Georgia and a research analyst at the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, and I'll be chairing this event. This event is hosted and organized by the ECPR and the blog site The Loop, and is part of its House Series. This event is being recorded, so it will be available on the ECPR YouTube channel in the near future. This roundtable continues the discussion centered around the Human Rights Measurement blog series in The Loop. The series was initiated by a blog post I published back in August 2022, so a bit more than a year now. Since then, we were lucky to have contributors from around the globe reading responses to this initial post. We have some of them with us today. If you're interested in checking the Measuring Human Rights series on The Loop or pitching your own idea for a blog entry, please visit their website. Now, please allow me to introduce our speakers. I'm going to try to be very briefly because I want to have them give them the opportunity to introduce themselves and also talk about the human rights projects they are involved with. So we have with us today Kay Clay, Associate Professor of International Affairs at the University of Georgia, Elizabeth Kaletski, Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at Ithaca College, Stephen Bagwell, Assistant Professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and Annie Watson, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Middle Georgia State University. Before we start, I want to thank ECPR and The Loop for this opportunity. I hope we can have a fruitful discussion centered around human rights measurement, which is more than appropriate considering we had Human Rights Day last Sunday. If we have time, we are going to have a brief Q&A section at the end, so you can type your questions in the chat box. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to our speakers. Chad, can you start? Please present yourself and talking about the human rights programs you are involved currently.
Sure. Thanks, Eduardo, and thanks for the introduction. As Eduardo said, I'm Associate Professor of International Affairs at the University of Georgia, where I'm also the Director of the Center for the Study of Global Issues. Human rights measurement. I've spent a long time collecting a lot of human rights data, pretty much as long as I've been in political science, which is starting to actually be a long time. But I am currently the co-founder and methodology research and design lead of the Human Rights Measurement Initiative. I also am one of the co-principal investigators of the Subnational Analysis of Repression Project, which I'll probably talk about later some as well. I'm one of the co-creators of the Workers' Rights in Law and Practice data, WorkR as we call it for short. I'm the former co-director of the Syria Human Rights Data Project, which is now archived. So done a little bit of human rights data collection over time.
Elizabeth, can you go next, please?
Sure. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Kaletski. I'm an associate professor of economics at Ithaca College. So I've done a bunch of work related to human rights. My dissertation work was actually on child labor, and I did a bunch of work on economic and social rights. And that sort of led me to Hermy as well, where I currently co-lead with Annie, the child rights stream at Hermy.
Annie, can you go next, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Watson. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Middle Georgia State University. I started off in women's rights, and so I'm the co-principal investigator of the CEDAW compliance codes. And with the others, I work at Hermy. As Liz mentioned, I am the co-lead of the child rights workstream. I'm also an analyst for the economic and social rights workstream and the associated project, the Social and Economic Rights Fulfillment Deck.
Thank you. Stephen, please.
Hi, everyone. Like Eduardo said, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis in the political science department. I, like all the other panelists, I've worked on a variety of human rights projects. I was a coder as a graduate student for the SIRI data project. I was a coder for the Subnational Analysis of Repression project. I'm now working with the Human Rights Measurement Initiative on the Economic and Social Rights team. And I'm working on developing some other measures of human rights as well that would hopefully address some issues that we found with our data. But I'll talk about that later because none of that is ready yet. So we'll get to that. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to have you all here. And I think we can start then by what are the measures of human rights doing right now? What is how it's being developed to a point that we can say that we are accomplishing right now? Maybe you could start, Stephen.
Sure. So this feels really self-aggrandizing to be like, yes, we work in human right measurement and here are all the things that we're doing really well, but it's not a bad place to start. I think there are a few things that we do particularly well. One is I think we've gotten fairly good over time for a big portion of the human rights that are codified in international law at measuring compliance with international law. Not perfect, but good. I don't know that we'll ever get to perfect, but I do think that the better we get at tracking compliance with international law, the better we can then get at seeing what specifically countries are doing in order to do better or worse at complying with international law. All of these are policy-related questions, law-related questions, and it's really tough to track, at least in a broad cross-country way, without good data. I think that's a real strength of what we're doing. I'm going to stop there. I could probably talk a little bit more, but I think everybody gets a crack at this. So I'll let somebody else jump in.
Nobody else wants to hop in, I'll hop. So I this is in some ways I'm jumping to what I think you're going to ask probably next if this is your question right now. But one of the things I think human rights measurement projects are doing sort of well right now and better than we have in the past, and I think that the overall discipline of human rights measurement has always been pretty good at, is recognizing our limitations, honestly. I actually think that over time, measurement projects have, I can think of a chart that Ken Bolin published in like 1985 on this. We've always acknowledged that the information we have on human rights violations is imperfect. It's if we depend on publicly available sources, it's almost inevitably biased in some way, shape, or form. It's usually an undercount of the total number of events that we'd actually like to capture. So there are all these shortcomings in our information sources and the things we have to rely on. And I think that, compared to a lot of other fields in political science, I think human rights has done a pretty good job of always being pretty honest about those shortcomings, of recognizing them and trying to grapple with them. And I think we see more and more of that actually moving forward. I think we've gotten better at recognizing what those potential shortcomings are. We've learned about some new ones over time. And I think we do a good job of trying our best to both be honest about what we know and what we don't know about our uncertainty, and also to try to deal with that uncertainty in a way where we can still say something useful and valuable about what's happening around the world. And so that's something I think that measurement projects are doing well.
I'll just sort of piggyback off of that too, because I think the idea of recognizing our limitations is really important, because it's also sort of helped us identify where those major gaps are. And so then we can say, okay, we don't have information on these specific things that we know are happening, but it's really hard to collect the data. And that's really sort of central, right? We need to know where the gaps and the limitations are in order to be better about it. And so I think we have been really successful about identifying those gaps, maybe not filling them all quite yet, but definitely getting in that direction.
Also really important to acknowledge, though, that even if what we're working with isn't perfect, it's still pretty awesome. I mean, without this kind of data, there is no holding governments accountable for abuses. There is no holding governments accountable for failures to apply their resources well. There is no moving forward because you don't know what we're currently doing. And so if you want to talk about what we're doing well, it's that these efforts are being made. It's that we are making these numbers, we are calculating these metrics, and we're seeing them out in the world doing good things. We're seeing improvements in the world because of them. And I don't think we can sort of overstate how good and important and vital that is.
Yeah, I agree. It's great that we have all those metrics now, and especially seeing what we had, decades before. It's really a huge improvement. But let me then make the opposite question, as Chad was mentioning. What do you think is like the huge challenge, the biggest challenges that human rights measurement projects have nowadays? What are like the barriers or shortcomings and things that we can do better? Maybe Elizabeth could start leading this discussion.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at the first go. So I think the limitations are different depending on the types of rights that we're talking about. But I'll just focus on children's rights since that is sort of my area. And so it's sort of strange, like children's rights relative to other forms of rights have actually received a lot less attention. And it's a little strange because generally there is acceptance of children's rights. I mean, the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is the most widely ratified international law. The US is the only UN party that has not ratified it. And despite that, we're still sort of behind other forms of human rights in terms of measurement. And part of that is simply because of the breadth of international law, right? So the CRC has 54 substantive principles associated with it. And so it's been really difficult to cover all of those things. So for children's rights in particular, we tend to see a lot of information on social and economic rights, primarily education and health. And we have just a lot less information on some of those other rights, like personhood, nationality, those sorts of things that are equally as important. And part of that is like the ease of collecting information on certain things, but it's also really limiting in the sense that like even where we do have good information, so for education in particular, we have a lot more information on, say, enrollment rates or the quantity of education than we do have on the quality of education. And so that information is sort of still limited in terms of how people actually experience those rights. And for children's rights in particular, I think one of the big limitations or one of the big issues that we really need to address is for certain vulnerable populations, and children are a really great example of this, we often think of them as like needing to be protected. And that's how a lot of our sort of measurement has progressed over time. But it's well recognized that children are rights holders. And so we need to treat them as rights holders as we're collecting this information. And the CRC has been really clear about children having autonomy and being included in the process. And I think in terms of measurement, we've sort of failed to live up to that standard. We should be having children sort of more in the process, right? They're not these sort of passive objects of measurement, but they should be the ones who are deciding what are the sorts of rights that we should be focusing on, how should we collect the data, analyzing the data, and I think even more importantly, having children actually being able to use the data, right? That is sort of purpose at the end there. So I'll keep it to that for now.
I'll hop in again. So I would, one of Elizabeth's big points, right? I think it can be blown up even bigger and just say, we just have done a poor job of covering the entire breadth of the international human rights regime, right? And if we think about what's available as measurement cross-nationally for sort of every country in the world, or for most countries in the world, right? Civil and political rights is the best covered ground historically, right? It's the thing that sort of people covered the most early. especially physical integrity rights, right? And so we've had measures of those for a very long time through a variety of different data sets. Economic and social rights are just really starting to catch up, largely thanks to the efforts of some of the people on this call, Susan Randolph, Sakiko Fukudapar, Tara Lawson-Rimmer, all these folks that have been really working on doing the best they can with the data we have on government performance and really converting those into rights metrics on economic and social rights. We now have good data on those and constantly improving data on those for a substantial time series, but that didn't really exist even as I'm not that old, as recently as when I was in graduate school. We really didn't have that. Women's rights, we've always had some data on as long as sort of like SERI existed. So like back in the 90s, we started getting some women's rights data, but it was limited and now, Annie has put in a lot of effort on this. Danny Hill, my colleague here at the University of Georgia, Sabrina Kareem, I know they've all been working on different data projects at improving our measures of women's rights, but those are all relatively recent efforts, right? Though among sort of the anti-discrimination treaties, the Women's Rights Treaty has probably been the best served by measures. I'm unaware of anything that's really solid in a human rights framework on, say, the International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial and Ethnic Discrimination, right? We don't really have anything in that front. There are some data sets that you can use that give you some purchase on that, but we haven't really thoroughly examined that document and turned it into cross-national measures yet. The same could be said on the Covenant on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the rights of the Covenant on the Rights of Migrant Workers, right? A lot of these treaties are just really underserved by existing data projects. So one thing we have to do better, right, is cover the entire list and the entire field of internationally recognized human rights. Likewise, I think we have done a very good job of taking really well-documented, publicly available data sources and turning those into data, and we have refined that process to a really skilled art at this point. But that information is limited in a number of different ways, and I don't know that we've made a lot of progress on how to go beyond it. And so the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, some of the work we're doing, right, in civil and political rights is moving beyond just relying on reports from the US State Department or Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or media reports, and going directly to human rights advocates on the ground to ask them what's happening in their countries, because they tend to know a lot more about what's happening than actually makes it into these sort of publicly available reports. But that's a cost-intensive project. It's one where it requires relationship building and time, and so we're slowly expanding to the whole world. But I mean, at this point, we likely will be able to have data on more than 40 countries in the next year or two, and hopefully we'll grow faster after that. But we've been at it for a while now, and it's a few countries a year, and that's largely due to the cost and resource intensity of sort of engaging that kind of activity. And I think that's true for a lot of the other potential information sources we could use for cross-national human rights data, right? It requires a lot of resources, it requires a lot of effort, and it requires a lot of infrastructure. And something that I think we've discovered in our work at Hermy is that it's often difficult to get funding for infrastructure. It's not flashy, it's not exciting, but these, as Annie mentioned earlier, these kinds of information are necessary, right? They're really, really needed and useful. And so, I think exploring and finding new information sources, incorporating those into a sort of cross-national metrics, the better we can get at that, the better quality our data will be and overcome some of the limitations we have in the information we've relied on for a really long time.
Of piggybacking off of that, one of the things that we've focused on as a field more is establishing cross-national measures so that we can compare countries. We're not as great. We don't have the data really to do subnational metrics quite as well. That's something that SNARP, the Subnational Analysis of Repression Project, is working on when it comes to physical integrity rights. But frequently, especially if you're working without a ton of resources and support and time, and you're on a tenure clock, it can be quite difficult to try and disaggregate some of these national level metrics into other metrics. So by region, by urban versus rural, by different identity groups, by age status, by all of these different things. And so while we're better able to talk about what's happening at the sort of broad zoomed out level in a country, we're not nearly as good about being able to talk about what's happening to different groups or different areas. I also think that, so while I was preparing my notes on this, what I have is just data, always data. That's my big sort of asterisk note. But I think when we're talking about challenges of human rights and measuring human rights, it's also important for us to talk about the cost to researchers and researcher trauma. Because we're human and we don't have endless emotional batteries, and we don't always get a ton of institutional support for this kind of data work, for this kind of topic or issue work. And I think that's one of the big costs that we always have to be aware of, is that there are a finite number of us and we're working with finite resources, both financial and emotional. And the importance of that, the weight of that, is important to acknowledge.
I'll jump in and try to be brief so we can get to some other questions too, but echo the rest of the panelists' point, and add a little bit of a focus on one specifically. For economic and social rights in particular, we rely on government data, and there are some sort of well-known issues with that. Like, it takes time, right? Like, if we're pulling data from the World Development Indicators, usually it takes countries a year or two to sort of report that, and the World Bank to validate it and verify it and make sure they're not like way off in whatever they're reporting. And then they'll put it on their website, and then we go download it from the website, and then we do our calculations. And that really leads to a 2 to 3 year lag at best by the time we can get it published. In addition to that, almost every year when we go and we look for more indicators for, I'll use the right to housing as an example, right? And housing affordability, different countries calculate that differently, which means that we have to go out and find a very specific indicator that is uniformly calculated, but not all countries are going to report it that way because they don't want to calculate it that way. Which means that we then face a trade-off. Do we focus on broader country coverage? Do we think some countries are more important to report data for? And so we pick the indicator with less coverage, but that might include like the US and China and the rest of sort of the permanent 5 Security Council members, if you think that's more important. And so there are sort of a lot of things like that. And then to build on what Annie said about data not always being disaggregatable by region or by ethnicity or other forms of identity, probably the best that we can do for a plurality, I won't even say majority of indicators, is disaggregate by sex. But specifically, we can't disaggregate for almost any country by ethnicity, because in a lot of countries, it's illegal to collect data on different ethnic groups, or illegal to ask even in surveys about different ethnic groups. That also leaves out issues of gender identity or sexual orientation and other things like that. So disaggregating the data is a really big challenge. The fact that it's illegal to do that is just like one potential form of political bias injecting itself into the data. We've also seen like tons of news reports or advocacy reports about other forms of political bias, whether it's Russia just like outright lying in their official statistics. China only allows like the PISA, the International Education tests in its most well-funded schools. Even New Zealand recently came out and said, hey, our education scores are probably biased. That's really good for transparency that they said that. But basically during the pandemic, They had a bunch of administrators say, our students are overwhelmed, we're not doing these tests. And so the selection of what schools didn't feel like their students were overwhelmed versus the ones that did, and took the test versus the ones that didn't, that's then going to bias the data also. And that doesn't mean that the biased data is useless, but it is something that we have to sort of be aware of. And that's sort of what I see as some of the big picture challenges, is all the different ways politics injects itself into the process, whether it's on the data side or the vagueness and abstractness of the way the laws are written that we're trying to track compliance with so that more countries will sign on to them because they have more leeway. The politics of all this matters a lot.
Thanks, everyone. That was very fascinating. Chad, you mentioned that, which is like at the center of the work of Hermy, which is the work with the practitioners, not only on the design of methodology, but also like we get our data from practitioners on the ground. So I want to ask about the impact of the human rights data. How do you think that having those human rights measurement projects can impact the work of practitioners on the ground? And also considering that human rights is such a sensible topic, how does human rights research or human rights research on measurement more specifically has to be accompanied by advocacy or not? And what is the role of the researcher then in this case?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. So I'll start with the question about how human rights measurement work can impact people who are dedicating their lives, right, really, to human rights advocacy on the ground. And something I'll note about Hermy, right, since you brought it up, is it's not just that we co-design our methodology with human rights practitioners on the ground. It's not even just that we get information from those practitioners, but we've also co-designed all of the tools for feeding back that information to the world with human rights practitioners, human rights advocates, and others. And so all of our data is on this website called the Rights Tracker, rightstracker.org. And all of the visualizations and stuff, we're in a constant redesign process with those. Those are constantly being changed, they're constantly being updated based on feedback we're getting from largely human rights advocates in the field and journalists that report on human rights lawyers, folks that we work with, that we want to make sure can access the data, understand the data, and use them. And that's partially in response to historically human rights data, because the collection process is dependent largely on academics, right? It hasn't been particularly accessible for everybody, right? It's been, you go to a website, you download an Excel file or a comma delimited file, and you got your data. And that's not the most accessible way to use the data, to understand the data for most people around the world. And so Hermy's taken a lot of effort into bringing that to bear. And if you look at Hermy's website, that's at humanrightsmeasurement.org, and look at all of the sort of impact stories that are there. There's a lot of examples of how those data have been used by human rights advocates in the field. One of my favorites is last year, I believe, when Hermy did its data release, the economic and social rights data for New Zealand got a good bit of traction in the New Zealand press. The Human Rights Commission, the leader of the Human Rights Commission, took up the data, talked a lot about them in the press, brought them to bear, used them to draw attention to all of the ways in which New Zealand wasn't living up to the expectations set out by the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And eventually, a response was issued by the Minister of Justice in New Zealand, right, in response to this advocacy that was really built around the data that came from Hermy, right? I'll use a personal example for me. Following the murder of George Floyd in the United States, right, in 2020, I had a lot of people approach me about, this is terrible, this is awful, but it's this isolated incident. So that person that carried out this isolated incident should be punished, right? And I found it incredibly useful to be able to turn to the Hermy data, to turn to Seer Rights data, to turn to the data that we have out there and say, look, there's not a data provider out there that's really focusing on physical integrity rights in the United States that's going to tell you the United States is doing well on physical integrity rights. And in fact, if you look at the Hermy data, most of our respondents are telling us that it's people of particular races, especially Black men, who are likely to experience physical integrity rights abuses at the hands of state agents. This isn't an isolated incident. It's an example of a trend that I can show you in the data. I think that ability to take stories that are powerful, that connect to people's hearts, and demonstrate that that story isn't an isolated incident, that story is part of a greater pattern and a greater a thing that we could all actually be working to change. I think that that's really, really useful. And I hope that human rights advocates see our data, pick it up, and use it. And so with all that said, it may not be surprising to you that if the question is like what the relationship is between sort of being a person that measures human rights and whether or not one's engaged in advocacy or not, like I'm not answering for everyone on this panel. Others on the panel may want to answer differently. I think that measuring human rights is advocacy. I don't see any other way for it to be. You know, I know that everybody likes to pretend that as political scientists, we're economists, or, you know, in any field we're in, that we're value neutral, that, you know, we're just following the scientific method, but we decide what we study, right? We decide what we think is important. We decide what we want to pursue. And by deciding to measure human rights, I've yet to meet a person who is out there measuring human rights that's agnostic to whether better human rights practices would be a good thing, right? And so it for me, I mean, I measure these things because I think they're important, and I want to encourage people around the world to do better on them. I want everyone to enjoy their human rights, and that's the reason I study what I study. So from my perspective, advocacy and the measurement of human rights are inherently linked. They have to be. My research work informs my advocacy and what I try to do. So I don't see any other way for it to be.
I'll just hop in. Oh,
Go
ahead, Annie.
Sure. So I just really agree with Chad. That's the work we do is advocacy. That being said, the field as a whole needs to do better about making it accessible. And we've seen some progress here. I think Hermie has done a lot of work trying to make our research accessible. But there's still a whole lot of human rights work that goes to die in scholarly journals. And if that's all we're doing, if we truly care about the things that we're researching, if we truly care about building a better world, we just can't do that. The standard average person, even if they had the time and inclination, probably can't afford to access a lot of scholarly work because of the paywalls. And so you have all of this knowledge that has been created, that has been established, and can't be applied because it's being kept from the people who could carry the work forward. And so when it comes to maybe the phrase pairing it with advocacy is a little weird since we all seem to agree that this is advocacy work. I think it does need to be paired with really strong accessibility efforts where all of our journal articles are coming with blog posts, are coming with TikTok or whatever social media videos, are coming with ways to communicate this to people who need to know about it, who need to know not just the individual stories, but also these trends and also their options for addressing them. And so, I mean, the only heated argument I got into in a seminar in graduate school was over whether or not we could afford to just sit in our ivory towers, or if we had the right to do that, given everything that we know. And my answer to that is, of course we don't. We need to be out there. We need to be making these things accessible, or what's the point? I mean, I love playing with numbers, but if I'm just doing it for fun, why these numbers? And I don't have a good answer for that because I'm so invested in the outcome. Excuse me, the outcomes.
I'm glad I let you go first because I was actually going to say something really similar. So I'll just piggyback off of that. But I think one of the things that always comes up when we're thinking about measures, and whether it's like building individual measures or building indicators, like as academics, one of the things that we do really commonly is we just get caught up in like the statistics of it and the math of it and like all of that kind of nitty gritty stuff, because that's what we're trained to do, right? That's what they taught us in grad school. But that's not really effective if nobody understands what we're talking about, right? And if the outcome that we get at the end of the day is not something that people can then actually use, what is the point? And I think children's rights is the perfect example of this, right? We have to acknowledge that children do have, right, these evolving capacities, and we need to sort of meet them where they are in certain circumstances, right? And we need to make sure that the measures that we are developing are accessible so that they can use them themselves, right? And so they can be the rights holders and they can be their own advocates, as well as, right, us advocating for them as well.
I agree with everything everybody else has said. This is probably not too surprising. You know, to echo Annie's point, right? Like, I like playing with numbers. I can either do human rights measurement or I could do like a Sudoku. The human rights measurement stuff seems to be much more useful for other people. And so I tend to do that more than the other. But, you know, I think the overarching goal is we want our data to be useful. And I think the label of advocate can sometimes, or the label of advocacy can sometimes be taken as inherently in opposition to the government. And I think in human rights work in particular, given that all governments are human rights abusers, that is especially true. But we also want our data to be really useful for policymakers and governments, right? Like, in an ideal world, they care about this stuff just as much as advocates do. Maybe we need to also do a better job of convincing them that they should care that much. But, you know, in an ideal world, you know, the Department of Justice in the US should care just as much about predominantly Black men being killed by police as much as advocates do from that community, right? Like that's what we want. And that's true, I think, for most economists, most political scientists, regardless of what issue area you're working in. You're writing it with at least some general idea that, hey, if a policymaker reads this, I would like them to be able to understand and hopefully find it useful. So I don't think we're unique in that way. I do think that we are inherently attached to advocacy when we're doing research, but I think that should also be true for literally any academic. And to the degree that it's not, I'll just say shame on them, and not feel bad about saying that either.
I want to tag on to Stephen's point with one last thing. To paraphrase my amazing colleague Amanda Murdy from a blog post a few years ago, right? Nobody asks a cancer researcher to be agnostic to cancer, right? Nobody's like, well, if you're going to research cancer, you can't really care about whether cancer is a good or bad thing, right? So this isn't unique to us. This isn't something, I think social scientists tend to get more in their feelings about this than other people do in other disciplines. But this isn't unique to us, right? Like, caring about like making the world a better place with our research is not a bad thing. Like, and we shouldn't view it as such.
Thanks. So Annie, you mentioned that as political scientists or economists, we all like to play with numbers. So maybe you could start answering this next question, which is, can metrics truly capture such a complex phenomenon such as human rights violations? Do we risk by any chance to dehumanize the victims' experiences when we try to render their suffering into numbers?
This is a question that's really close to my heart, and I would probably push back a little bit on the idea that all academics like to play with numbers. I have academic friends who sort of hiss and back away slowly when numbers come into play. I certainly do. This is one of my great joys, is playing with numbers, and a privilege that I have. But especially studying the things we study, this is maybe the difference when Chad talks about getting in our feelings about having a preferred outcome or being attached to our subjects in some way. The question is the humanity. I don't think we have to worry about the humanity of a tumor, but we do really have to worry about the humanity behind someone who was imprisoned or tortured or married as a child bride or any of these other really horrible things that we talk about. And so if we remove that experience from what we do, we are ignoring the fact that somewhere out in the world there is or was someone who actually experienced this thing. And we're saying that their experiences are exactly the same as any number of other experiences, no matter how true that may or may not be. And so that is certainly the concern when we look at these big, huge aggregated numbers, is that we're not really looking at stories anymore. We're not looking at the humans involved. And I think that that's part of the reason why it is so necessary for us sitting with our computers and our R and Stata and everything else to work closely with and to embed ourselves in the knowledge being produced by our counterparts who are out working in the fields, who are out talking to people, who are collecting these lived experiences. The work we do has no meaning without their context, but the work we do also provides additional context to them. We can never separate those two. We need both the trends that Chad was talking about before, where we know just where this fits in the bigger context, in the bigger story, so that we can push for change, that we can push for new policies, so we can push for justice. But we also really need to recognize that there are stories embedded in these things. One of the best examples I've heard of, and I was trying to find the name and I couldn't, and so I need to go back and dig through some notes somewhere, but there was a database collecting femicides in, I think, Mexico. And so one of the things they really wanted to do because of this question of dehumanization was to collect not just the numbers, not just the statistics, but also stories about the people involved, stories about the women whose lives were lost. And so in this database, they asked the loved ones who remained if they were okay with their loved ones being included. They included pictures and names and stories and details and this kind of human aspect of this to counteract this. And I don't know that that's possible for every data project to do. That takes a lot of work and a lot of resources to focus on this kind of thing. But I do think that there are probably these sorts of projects being done that it would be hugely productive for us to interact with and to link to and to lift up so that we're all kind of working on this mutually beneficial relationship between these different kinds of projects.
Yeah, I want to second that. And I also kind of want to steal a little bit of a tagline from Hermie with the what gets measured matters, right? And so in that particular case, when we think about the data aspect of that, like we need to be collecting that information in order to keep it on the agenda, right? We know that there is humanity right behind these numbers that we're looking at, and we're really trying to use those numbers to continue to advocate and to continue to get people to acknowledge that these things are going on. So it's never going to be that we have a perfect measure of all of these things. Some things are going to get lost in that translation, but it is an essential component to really making progress.
I'll jump in, and I think you would be, I'll phrase it differently. We are very aware of the humanity of the numbers that is attached to the numbers that we are generating. Whether it was reading pages and pages of detailed abuses in Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and US State Department reports, or working with practitioners, seeing how they use our data or the information they provide in qualitative contexts rather than just answering survey, closed multiple choice survey questions. We see abuses all the time. I can remember very clearly when I was a coder for SNARP, reading about police setting up roadblocks, demanding bribes, and then killing people who did not provide bribes in Nigeria, for example. And yeah, we took that information and we turned it into a number. But at no point in time did we measure the suffering of people who were killed, right? Like we're not trying to put a number on human suffering. We're trying to create numbers that we can use to hold governments accountable. And I think that's a misconception that sometimes gets attached to human rights measurement, is that we are trying to measure explicitly how much people are suffering, and that is how much individuals are suffering. An unindividual person is suffering, and that is both not our intent and way beyond our capacity to do. And even if we had the capacity, I don't know that we would want to. What we want to be able to do is hold governments accountable for their behavior or their agents' behavior. And pairing qualitative information, stories, those narratives that Annie mentioned, with a quantitative context to show this is not an isolated incident, this is happening all over your country or routinely being perpetrated by, in Nigeria, like the SARS police force or others, is incredibly powerful. And I don't think we should lose sight of that at all.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, you know, this ties in a little bit to something Annie said earlier in response to a different question, which is there's, and I'm saying this somewhat because my guess is this is an ECPR event, and I suspect some of you on the call would like to research or are already researching human rights yourself. And I think it's important that we talk about, you know, some of this. If you dive deep enough into it, it means exposing yourself to trauma, right? It does. And you know, and so as Steven said, I do think it's you know, most people you find that are engaged deeply in human rights measurement projects are maybe too connected sometimes to the very human stories that those data are being generated from. I do think sometimes it's not necessarily about the measurer, it's about the person using the measure. And I do think it's important to make sure that folks who just come to our data online and pull them down, that they also are aware of that human connection, that they don't lose sight of what this is coming from and where it's coming from. But you know, as I sort of talked about in my examples from New Zealand and from my own experience in the United States earlier, I think stories make data more effective, and I think data makes stories more effective, right? That those things hand in hand strengthen one another. In fact, I'm actually doing some research with Matthew Rains and Meredith Lavelle and Mena Abdelwahab on this question exactly. We're doing some experiments to look at, right? Like if you pair, you know, data, human rights measurement with stories, right, about things that people have experienced, does that make others more likely to respond to them by trying to make their government change behavior than if they're exposed to either one alone, right? And you know, so far we're like, it seems hopeful that that's the case. We'll see if it turns out that way in a sort of broad-based statistical way. But I know in my one-on-one interactions and in some of the examples we have from Hermie that at least on some occasions it absolutely seems to work that way.
Thanks. I have one last topic to discuss, and then we can move forward for a Q&A section. So if people have questions on their mind, they can already start typing on the chat box. So I want to know what's next. If you can share some projects we're involved with, what are new measurement programs we're working with, new developments in the field that you want to share.
I'll start. So we've I think there's a lot, and there's many I don't know about, right? I know the things I'm working on. If we're talking about sort of what's next, I don't know what other people are working on, if they're sort of not out in the field yet. We've brought up the Subnational Analysis of Oppression project a number of times in here today. If you look that up online, the data that are available publicly right now are relatively limited. We're rounding the corner on that project, and hopefully in the next year or two, you'll be able to obtain sort of if any of you are familiar with sort of Chris Ferris's latent variable physical integrity rights data, we'll be able to provide data like those at the country year level, not only for all overall physical integrity rights, but for each of the sort of underlying rights that were typically included in those measures: the right to be free from enforced disappearance, from extrajudicial killing, from political or arbitrary imprisonment, and from torture and ill treatment. And hopefully be able to do some analysis at a level lower than the state, right? Now, I'm not going to make big promises about how low a level you'll be able to get to and have meaningful data. We're still working that part out, but the idea is that you'll be able to, if you're interested in sort of doing more regional analyses within countries, that you'll be able to use our data to do that and not just have to use one number for the entirety of a country over the entirety of a year. So I know that's forthcoming. I know Hermie has several projects in the pipeline, some of which you all will talk about, so I'll leave it to you. But I know Eduardo and I and Stephen, we've had some early effort put in on labor rights, on producing some new labor rights data. That's something we hope to get off the ground in the future. In truth, with Hermie, if you think of an area of human rights, we have a desire to start moving into that area and working in it. It's a matter of finding people to lead those areas and finding the funding to support getting those projects off the ground. So if that's something you're interested in, you should always feel free to reach out to us. And I'll leave it there for now. There's probably other stuff I could bring up, but I want to leave it to my colleagues to talk about their work. So.
I'll talk very briefly about a project that I'm working on that will probably take the rest of my career, barring a massive amount of new resources or a lot of help from interested people. If you're interested, please let me know. I'm happy to collaborate. I am trying to create a subnational disaggregatable version of economic and social rights data. Right now I'm working on health. And next semester, I'm going to be working on health and housing in a couple of countries. If you're interested in what that looks like, it's very similar to the civil and political. It will be very similar to the civil and political rights data that Hermie produces. It's expert survey based. So going out to healthcare advocates, those who work in policy research, and the same for housing, and asking them questions that allow us to create scores that are comparable across countries and across subnational units within countries, ideally over time. So that's a lot to try to squeeze into one project, but that's one thing. I'm going to talk also a little bit about two projects that are in development that I've seen presented at conferences that are actually not even Hermie affiliated. Jennifer Barnes is a graduate student at Vanderbilt University, and she has two projects that are just really, really, really cool. One is called the Societal Violence Scale. This was something that I believe was previously published alongside the Political Terror Scale, which is another measure of physical integrity rights that's been around for a long time, that measures the overall level of human rights abuses and violence in a country aside from just state-sponsored violence. I think I'm summarizing that right in a brief one-liner. And then the second thing she's working on is something that I have wanted to get to, and I am both jealous and very happy that she's getting to it before me, because I've wanted to do it for almost a decade now, but measures of impunity. So are agents who commit abuses actually held accountable? So she's working on both of those projects. And those are awesome, and I can't wait for them to come out.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just mention something Annie and I have been working on. So because we're sort of co-leading the children's rights work stream at Hermy. We've been sort of working on generating measure of children's rights that we're calling Cheeries for children's rights. And so part of what we're trying to do is address some of the things that we've actually talked about today, some of the issues and the limitations in current data measures. And so we've been able to expand some of the measures going back to the early 2000s. We were able to cover a lot of countries, and we're sort of still working on that and still perfecting it. And Annie can certainly talk a little bit more about that if she likes. But I think the big thing for us is we're sort of getting ready to think about, bringing it to co-design and getting some input for different stakeholders. And I think one of the big things that Chad already mentioned is funding is always an issue for that. That takes resources and time and energy and money. And so we're sort of continuing to work on that, and would love to hear if anyone is interested in that as well.
I think that Liz has provided a good overview of our child rights work. The only other thing that I want to mention is that Danny Hill, who we've mentioned a few different times here, and I are working on updating our CEDAW compliance codes. We published those in 2019. And they only went through 2012, I think, at the time. So we're bringing those up to hopefully at least 2020. And then we're also working on disaggregating those as well. So instead of just a broad measure of women's rights, we'll have women's political rights, economic rights, and social rights that will be available as their own scores. And he and Sabrina Kareem are just about to have a book out with some different measures of women's rights that will be just fantastic to finally get my hands on. I've been hearing about this one for a long time, so I want to make sure to boost their book too.
Yeah, that was on my list when we came back around, is like to talk about Danny and Sabrina's book. So Sabrina Kareem and Danny Hill, their book Positioning Women in Conflict Studies comes out, I think, spring 2024, like so in the next few months, and that should have some really interesting material that could at the very least be used in women's rights work, and is connected to some of the women's rights work that Annie and Danny have been doing separately. And then I'll mention just a couple of projects I know people have working in-house here at Globus, actually. So one of our PhD students here, Meredith Lavelle, is doing a lot of work on digital repression. I don't know, it as has been mentioned many times, right? We're not sure what form this will take in the long run, because project development takes a long time and it's very costly. She's doing already a lot of great conceptualization work, and I will have at least some data on digital repression coming out sometime in the next couple of years. Likewise, Matthew Rains, another PhD student here at the University of Georgia, and also Hermy Civil and Political Rights Lead, has been dedicating a whole lot of effort to effectively disaggregating our physical integrity rights data according to different marginalized groups, different can we get down to which kinds of identities, which kinds of group memberships, which kinds of perceptions from others, right, lead one to be targeted for violence by the state. And his dissertation tackles a lot of that work, and he's been in a pretty constant stream of working on producing data on that for the last few years, and so I'd expect to see that sometime in the future as well.
That's great. A lot of projects to look forward. I think we can start a Q&A section now. If someone has a question, please type in the chat box, or I can also unmute you if you want to ask it. I have one question in the chat by Fridiana Susanto. I can unmute you if you want to ask directly to the speakers, or I can read it too. Question is, what would be a doable mechanism to ensure that there's a certainty on the accessibility to collected data of a particular human rights situation? In the same vein, what would qualify characteristically as official measure data? Would it be for an independent source or results from a national government's initiative?
I'm happy to take a first stab at this and let others chime in when I'm wrong. But on the first question of a doable mechanism to ensure that there's certainty on the accessibility to collected data, I mean, it ties into sort of your second question in the sense that I'm aware of projects that are aimed at creating clearinghouses for data that's collected in the field, right? So let's say you're an NGO and you've been collecting information on killings that have been happening around the country, but you also are aware that the government's monitoring what you're doing, or what you're trying to do, and that you may not have a way of making these data publicly available into perpetuity, right? Well, like there are organizations that have been trying to establish various like NGO data clearinghouses where you can store those data. They can be archived there, and it kind of ensures that those data are always accessible, even if the state engages in actions locally to try to shut down whatever you've been engaged in. And so that's one way. And I think it really does require sort of independent organizations with usually transnational structures, so they're not subject to any individual states like permissiveness of their holding those data, to really ensure that those things hang around and stay around for a long time in archives. That's my brief kind of simple answer to that question. There's probably more to it than that. On your second question on what would qualify as characteristically official measured data, well, I mean, in the area of human rights, right? The official data is basically not to be come by, not in the way that official data is defined by states, which is typically if a state says something is official data, it means these are data that we made. Here, have them. Now they are official. And in most cases, state data on human rights practices are often not trustworthy. There are exceptions to that. So if a country has a well-organized, independent national human rights institution, right, that is funded by the government, but is independent in its action from the government, in my mind, that would be, if in an ideal world, every country would have a great national human rights institution, and that would be the best source of data any of us could have, right? Because they would be responsible for really collecting the information on what's happening in their countries. I think those can be really, really great sources of data, and if the government is likely to disagree with what they produce, but that is a government-funded source of data. That it can often be viewed as a little more official. Other than that, I think the reason that you're hearing from the four of us today, the reason that human rights measurement works the way it is that we know we can't depend on states to be honest about this, right? Depending on states to be honest about their human rights abuses is like expecting any person you suspect of a crime to just come clean the minute you ask them if they committed a crime, right? They're not going to tell you that. And in fact, we actually know states try to mislead us on many types of data, even data that we treat as typically objective, right? We find all kinds of bias in reported gross domestic product numbers, for instance, right? States want to make it seem that their economy is larger and more successful than it actually was, right? So in general, this is just not an area where I think we can trust anything that in general would be defined as the official statistics. And so my solution to that and my answer to that is that we need a lot of different people collecting human rights data in a lot of different ways. And we need to use those many different methods of producing those data together and in concert to come up with answers that we really think we can believe in. Now, we have some statistical methodologies that can help us do that, right? And that many of us here have used, right? Different kinds of measurement models, different kinds of latent variable models, different ways of bringing different kinds of information on board and making them speak to one another. And so I think, political science especially is at the forefront of thinking about the ways that we do that. But in general, that seems to me to be the only way to get to something that I would view as the most believable data. Are states ever going to treat it as official? I've got my doubts, right? I've long ago, maybe I've gotten old and cynical. I've long ago sort of given in to the idea that states are always going to view me as the enemy, as the person that's reporting on them. And they're not going to just wholeheartedly endorse my data unless they're talking about my data on a different country that they want to say something about. Then they'll talk about my data all day. But for the most part, and there are some exceptions to this, Mexico used the Syria Human Rights Data Project in their National Human Rights Plan several years ago. Though I would say Mexico has a National Human Rights Institution, and they probably could collect better, more accurate, more refined data for the country of Mexico than Syria's categorical data that was used for every country in the world. So in general, I just given up on the official title for data and instead just try to focus on, well, what's the best we can do with what we have, and that's what I'm going to use, and that's what I'm going to focus on. That was a very scattered answer. I apologize.
I just piggyback on that too. I would say it's also important to remember that there's lots of different sources of data, and this sort of gets to Chad's sort of last point there, where you have like the quote unquote official stuff that comes out of like tax records or administrative data sets and that sort of thing from lots of especially high income country governments. But then you also have like journalists who are tracking events that are happening in individual countries. And then you have advocates and experts who are on the ground talking about some of these more anecdotal things. And I think bringing all of those things together is the thing that's really going to paint the full picture and also allow us to say, okay, the government's saying this, but then we have this information over here that's sort of contradicting that or is adding to that. And it's this combination of the quote unquote official and some of these other sources that's coming from researchers and advocates and everything else. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I was going to say something else, but now I can't remember. So I'll leave it at that.
I do have one final question. I think we have time for this. What I want to ask for all the speakers, which is a lot has been said now by new technological developments such as artificial intelligence, machine learning. So how do you think those new technologies can affect human rights measurement and help maybe shape methodologies in the near future? I don't know if you have any insights on this.
I mean, I'll start out just talking about SNARP a little bit because we're using machine learning there. And I think it, in my mind, is sort of the way that I see machine learning and AI being used well in human rights work, because it's dictated entirely by human rights principles from the beginning, right? So with SNARP, we're pulling out every individual allegation of physical integrity rights abuse made in reports produced by the U.S. State Department, the Amnesty International annual reports, and the Human Rights Watch annual reports, and collecting data on multiple levels on each of those allegations. So in terms of human hours to do that, right, if we were going to do that for all of that collected information, we're talking about, 10, probably hundreds of thousands of hours of labor to get there. And it's not just labor, it's labor that of the kind we've been talking about, where it's humans having to sit and read really horrible things and take that emotional mental load on themselves and figure out how to do it. So we didn't want to do it that way. We didn't want to require that of people, at least not require that much of them. And so what we've done is we've had humans code the amount of information that we needed to train an algorithm to do the rest effectively, right? That doesn't entirely take out the entire human cost of having to read, those really traumatizing things, but it does reduce the number of traumatizing things any individual human had to read. And so we've effectively used that process to train several algorithms, in fact, actually, to pull out every allegation of physical integrity rights abuse and code them on a number of different areas. The reason I use that as an example is because I think that that's the way we can go. Like if we're thinking about these large language models, if we're thinking about other forms of AI and how we use them, I think the best way to use them is to train them with the human rights focus from the very beginning. I don't see, you'll see a lot of people that are trying to do this kind of work by just picking up ChatGPT off the shelf or picking up another tool that already exists off the shelf. Well, a lot of those tools contain a whole lot of biases that we don't want in our human rights information, right? They because they're trained on text and on information that just isn't human rights text. It's not trained with the human rights lens. It's not factored in that way. Another great organization that's doing some work on this is Huradox. They've been funded. I think they've been funded twice now by Google to work on the tagging and coding of individual human rights documents provided to them by NGOs all over the world using artificial intelligence. But if you talk to our colleagues at Huradox about how that's gone, they will tell you it has been a very intense process. It's taken a lot more work and a lot more money than they ever expected it would, because they basically had to start from scratch in terms of training these models to think like human rights researchers and human rights advocates, rather than thinking like generic person trained by the internet, right? Which I think we can all think of a number of reasons why a generic person trained by the internet may not be the best human rights researcher that we could imagine. And so, I think that there is a future for these kinds of tools, right? In human rights work. In fact, I think we'll all end up using a lot of them down the line. But I've also heard a lot of talk from different organizations and others about them being sort of a silver bullet, a cost-saving mechanism, a way to get things done easier. And in the long run, they can be, but in the short run, it's going to be far more costly and far more work than you maybe imagine it will be right now, because you can't just pick something up off the shelf and use it.
Chad's done a really good job talking about sort of the potential of AI, but the other side of this, when it comes to human rights in general, but human rights measurement as well, is that there's been a ton of work showing how AI can further oppression. And so I'm thinking of work by Ruha Benjamin, who's done a ton of work on this, particularly with regards to race. There was Algorithms of Oppression by, I think, author was Sophia Noble, Invisible Women by Carolyn Criado Perez. So there's so much work showing that these sort of large-scale data AI kinds of projects can be abusive in and of themselves and oppressive in and of themselves. And so I think that the other kind of side of this is that as these are used more commonly, as these become more and more advanced, we're going to have to be researching and be looking out for and measuring the kinds of harms that they themselves are doing, so that we can respond to that or adjust them or replace them or do something.
Thanks for the answers. Indeed, something very interesting that's coming up now, and I think will have definitely some consequences to human rights measurement as well. So with that, we are wrapping up this virtual roundtable. I want to thank everyone who attended the event, our speakers, and also ECPR and The Loop. Please remember to check the Human Rights Measurement blog series at the Loop website, and I wish you all a great rest of the week. Goodbye.